Okay, greetings. In this presentation, we're going to be discussing web graphics and some important points regarding options for placing images on web pages. Of course, this is a very important topic because pages without graphics are really boring. So we know that the use of photos and vector graphics of different types really is important to the user experience and to the whole process of website communication, sales, what have you. Videos are also important too, but graphics are even much more common. It's very rare, probably never anymore, that we visit a page that does not have website graphics. Often we see multiple versions of the same graphic on different pages or in different places on the website, larger and smaller versions and so forth. Of course, we see a combination of photographs and vector graphics or hand-drawn images and all different types of images on websites, including some things we wouldn't think of necessarily as graphics files, which really are, like Google Fonts or Font Awesome icons. Okay, so here on this page, up at the top, primary considerations, file size versus image quality, is something that we refer to often generically as image optimization. So we need to maintain high quality for either our photograph or our vector graphic, but at the same time we don't want to make that file larger than needed because that slows down the page loading and it degrades the user experience. It also hurts search engine ratings for that page because it's not properly optimized. Also, scalability, that really comes into play mainly with the new kid on the block known as scalable vector graphics, or the SVG format. And Font Awesome icons and Google Fonts are examples of SVG format files. And their advantage, primary advantage, is that they can be scaled up to any size or down, but the file sizes remain small and you're always working from just one file, which is not true of either JPEGs or PNGs. Now, we can always scale a JPEG or a PNG down in real time, but if we're serving the largest version of that file, it may be unnecessarily slow. And then secondly, we can never scale a JPEG or a PNG up above the dimensions that it was initially uploaded at, right? Because as we do, it will become blurry, unlike an SVG. So those are some of the main considerations. And in terms of creating the thumbnail versions, the smaller versions, usually that is done automatically by your CMS platform or the overall toolkit that you're using for that website. Not necessarily. Sometimes you may have a methodology where you need to export, a medium size and a small size along with the large size for certain things you're doing, and you can set up batch processes to do that from something like Photoshop or Darktable or Picasa or GIMP, etc. But usually, like let's say you're using WordPress and you have a good theme environment for WordPress, you're going to upload your largest version of that image to be the featured image for a post or a photo for a photo gallery, and the theme is automatically going to know to cut down several thumbnail size versions for two different main purposes. One would be to display that image in a different context where it's supposed to be smaller, and also for responsive issues, generic responsive issues like large size display, medium size display, small size display. Okay, and that part is usually done generically, or automatically, I should say. But what it can't do for you is if it's a JPEG or a PNG, it can't upload it, or rather display it larger than your original upload without blurring it. And so this gets into the issue of what your target display size is and so forth. You don't want to go any bigger than you need to, because here you'll see load times correspond with file size for images, width times height calculation. So if you had a JPEG, which is what's called a bitmapped image as opposed to a vector image, and you upload it at twice the width that it should be, ideally, it's also going to be twice the height that it should be, right? Because the aspect ratio is preserved. That means that the file size will be 4 times larger than it should be, because it's height or width times height. 2 times 2 is 4. It's going to be 4 times larger than it should be. So maybe it should be 200K in full-size pop-up display for a photo gallery page, and instead of 2K, it's going to be almost a meg. That sort of thing, okay? So, and then here under File Format Options, JPEG and PNG are the two most common seen on the internet. If it's a photo, it's always going to be JPEG. Sometimes we will also save a vector image as a JPEG, because if the mathematical formulas for the vectors get so complicated with detail and multiple colors and all that, sometimes those PNGs will become unacceptably large. PNG is what's called a lossless format, which means you never have any degradation of quality. But the trade-off is that the file size can become unacceptably large, potentially. And in some of those cases, you might instead save it as a JPEG, where you usually have a quality compression setting of about 85. And between Photoshop or GIMP or whatever program you're using, you can experiment with that quality setting to see on your targeted display resolution, where can you set that at the lowest quality without having any visible change in the quality on the display's maximum display that you're targeting. So I've done that, for example, on the 1080 display, 1080p displays I target, maximum size of 1900 pixel width approximately. Realistically, the averages are less than that. And I have found that a JPEG quality setting of about 85 in either GIMP or Photoshop or Picasa is about what I want. If I go to 83, 82, I'll see just a tiny, tiny degradation. Not on every image, but on some. Depending on the subtlety of the colors or detail, I will see some. If I go up to like 88% or in that range, I don't see any improvement. So I've stuck with 85, then I'm getting the smallest size with no compromise in quality for my targeted visitors and displays. All right? So that's how that works. Okay, and then you see you can read these things for yourself. If you have the option of exporting a graphic from Illustrator or Inkscape, a program like that, that is able to directly export SVGs versus a PNG, that's really the way to go. It's going to load faster, and it can scale up sort of infinitely, which is again and down, of course, why font awesome icons and Google fonts are becoming so popular. That's one of the reasons. Okay, and then GIFs is the final format that has been common on web pages over the last 20 or so years, mainly because there's a format called animated GIF, where you can take, a series of images, and it's kind of like a cartoon. It just replays, right? We've all seen that. And so as of 2018, browsers still support GIF for that reason, but it's on its way out. It's what's called deprecated, meaning it's not going to be around forever. And in its place, the APNG format has been introduced, and as of 2018, all the major browsers support APNG, which stands for Animated PNG, because the PNG format was already, everybody was using it. However, we can also always animate a series of images just using JavaScript on the fly. You can put the images in a folder, you get these JavaScript routines, jQuery, others, and so forth. The PNG, however, should load a little bit faster, okay, and be a little bit simpler once we get the methods down for creating those and exporting them. And as I say, the browsers already support them. Okay, before we go on to the next slide in this presentation, I'm going to switch over to another tab, and we're going to look at, or window, and we're going to look at the website of a newspaper from Costa Rica, an English language newspaper. And I checked this website just this morning, and what I saw is something that all of us periodically see on a website, where the images were loading in really slowly. And when you see that, what it almost always means is that the image that's being shown is substantially larger than it needs to be, okay? And so now what you're talking about is a degradation of the user experience to some degree. People who are on a limited data plan on a smartphone are maybe getting an image that's 10 times larger and more than it should be. And if you got 20 of those on the page, you can do the math and see what that amounts to. And Google and the other search engines are also going to dock you some for non-optimized aspects to your page, okay? So this is a real, like, webmaster, web development 101 issue, and for web designers too. Let's go over and take a look at that. So this is a page on the Tico Times website, English language newspaper. I lived in Costa Rica many years ago. I still have some friends there, and I go there no more than like once a month to this website and check some of the news. So I'm going to reload this page. I cleared the browser cache, so it should be reloading the images. And I want you to watch how slowly this image fills in right here. And I can tell you that I found out that the size of it is like, I mean, it's literally 100 times bigger, the file size, than it should be for this quality. 100 times plus. That's not good. So let's reload the page and watch what happens here. Okay, it's reloading the page. Now watch how slowly this image probably is going to come in. Well, we missed it. Somehow my page, oh, yeah, the page, they're updating their website. They're updating their website, and I don't know why this is Chrome, is real sticky here for some reason. It doesn't have, that's one of the reasons I really like Firefox, is that it's got better smooth scrolling than Chrome. Also, the full window version aspects of display and Firefox I like better. Anyway, let's try it again. So I'm going to reload this page and watch this image right here fill in. Hopefully this time we'll see it happen. Okay, I'm not going to move it. There we go. Watch how slow, see how slow that is? Like, oh my God. And my connection is not that slow. I checked the file size because I did this experiment before I recorded this video. That is a 6 meg JPEG, 6 megabytes. That image should be no more than 20K approximately. Yeah, I mean, I saved it. It's displaying, that display width is 250 pixels. But here's what we're going to do, is I'm going to say copy the image here, and then I'm going to go down to my wonderful free open source Photoshop alternative known as GIMP, G-I-M-P, and I'm going to load that image in, and we're going to look at the dimensions. So there it is, and you cannot see up at the top of this screen in GIMP, it shows me the pixel dimensions. It is 6,000 pixels by 4,000, and it's displaying on this page at 250 pixels wide. Okay, so 6,000 is 4 times 6, it's 24 times wider than it should be. But by being 24 times wider, it's 24 times taller than it should be. That's 24 times 24 times bigger in terms of file size than it should be. What's 24 times 24? It's 600 and something. The file size, so I said more than 100 times, try 600 times. Crazy. So that's an example where their webmaster is taking a photo with a camera. It's being captured in a high resolution, which is good because then you get full color depth and you get, no blurriness even when there's motion and all that, like he's moving his hand and it doesn't show blurry because it was captured with high resolution depth. The colors are real good, but then this should be reduced from 6,000 pixels wide for that home page to 250. It should be reduced to exactly the size it displays at. Then the CMS platform for another page, you click on it and it appears at, let's say, 600 pixels wide, should have a version of it that's 600 pixels wide. But none of those are going to be anywhere close to what showed. Okay, so that's a quick demo of how important this image optimization topic is. And the other thing is that when we take photos with smart phones and cameras, usually we want to improve them in advance. We want to crop them. We want to improve the contrast, etc. Maybe change the saturation. And then you should develop a routine for batch exporting those. Like you can do that in Photoshop, you can do it in GIMP, you can do it in Darktable, and I've used all 3 of those, and Picasa. I've used all 4 of those to batch process like hundreds of photos at a time, or just whatever my photo shoot is. I take 40, 50 photos, I go through, and I use those programs, the 2 of them, Picasa or Darktable, to go through the whole gallery and then export it. I don't go through the whole gallery one at a time for larger galleries with Photoshop and GIMP because it's too time consuming. But if I have gone through them in advance and cropped them and so forth with another program, then I can batch export them with either Photoshop or GIMP. Your CMS platform may do that for you, but don't count on it until you know for sure that you can upload an original of this size, like 6,000 pixels wide, and rely on your CMS to cut it down, for the largest version it will deliver and have good quality. Don't do it, okay? And so that's a big aspect of what we call image optimization. So let's go back up here now. We've pretty much gone through this slide, and now let's go on to our next slide in this presentation. Okay, there's icon for screenshot for GIMP over on the right. So photos are always bitmapped images, and they're going to always be JPEGs on a website. Vector graphics are created with programs like Illustrator, Inkscape, Photoshop, GIMP, and others. And then those might be PNGs or SVGs. However, sometimes we'll save them as a JPEG, again, because we get a substantially smaller file size than a PNG and no appreciable or no noticeable quality loss. Okay, so that middle section of the slide we've already kind of covered. Responsive alternatives. Multiple image versions is the most common, and single image only restricted range application. So multiple image versions means you upload a featured image for a new article or post in WordPress to your website, and you know that the maximum display width for those featured images on your post is 800 pixels. So you improve the image, whether it's a photo or hand-drawn graphic or whatever, and then you export it at 800 pixels width in the aspect ratio that you want, height that you want. That is then what you upload to WordPress as your featured image. And then you count on WordPress, the theme involved, to cut down and produce multiple smaller versions of it for thumbnails and for responsive display purposes if needed. Okay? The source code that when somebody goes and visits any one of those pages on that WordPress website will have a lot of CSS at media queries in it. So you'll actually see in the source code at media and then different things. It'll say like max width, max height, this sort of thing. Max width is typically seen. It can say max device width. There's variations. But what's happening is that this is part of CSS rather. It's ubiquitous now because of responsive issues and the importance of responsive design. And the browser is able to determine, okay, this visitor to the website has a smaller resolution smartphone. It's only 800 pixels wide, as opposed to someone else visiting that website at the same time who has a display that's 1900 pixels wide. Okay? So different versions of the JPEG or the PNG will be served by that WordPress theme automatically. You don't have to do anything. And the person with the smaller device does not have to wait for a file to download that's 4 times bigger than what they want, and maybe 10 of those on the page. Okay? So that is the most common method for delivering multiple different types of multiple different versions rather of a graphics file for 2 different purposes, one being different display formats on different pages and responsive issues. But we can also always resize a given image on the fly. Your Android or your EOS operating system may do that automatically for you. Typically they do by default along with the browser. Or we can adjust specifically how that image will display with things like the CSS max width property, okay, and still have the images be responsive but at a controlled display format. But the caveat there is that unlike the first method, we're delivering the same file. So even if we're rendering it quite small, they have to wait for potentially a larger version to download than is needed. Okay, so what kind of aspect ratio or display resolutions rather should we be targeting today? Basically, we're in the 720p range as a sweet spot, and moving up to the 1080p range, we're between those two. The sweet spot to target for visitors in the United States and in general is between the 720p display size and the 1080p. So these are formats you can see over on the right hand side of the screen. They've really come from the world of video. Way back we had the 480p display size. Then 720 and 1080 are what are called HD for high density. And then it's been moving beyond that recently to something called 4K. But 4K is kind of like hula hoops at this point. It really, it bloats the file sizes so dramatically for graphics images and videos compared to the installed base and the need for it that I don't at all recommend it. It's really not a practical standard that's being used by web designers, developers in the United States and in Europe and globally as part of our daily work. We are targeting now, we're taking very seriously the 1080p display size, which is a width of 1920. That's very real, and in general, you know, the professional developers and designers are using that display size for most of their work because that's kind of like the target display size, even though the average is below that, but the trend has always been, you know, to move up with time. There are certain givens regarding the human eye and the distance people sit from screens and the physical size of devices we want, which determine that this 4K, you know, it's not going to become the popular, most common thing anytime soon. Because, like, I have had portable computers for over 20 years. And the size that I prefer is a 14-inch diagonal display. I've had that size forever. It hasn't varied more than an inch or so. there's a certain limit to how big you want a monitor to be on your screen. There's a certain limit to how big of a phone you want to try to cram into your pocket and carry around everywhere and sit on when you're driving. We all know about that, okay? So those are limits now, physical limits to displays, right? We have limits to the human eye. It's kind of a done deal. What the eye sees, we have limits and standards of how far we sit away from computers. And if you put all those factors together, this is something I really just thought of in the last couple days as I was preparing to do this video. And it's really interesting to me to think of this and realize it, because I never took time out to, analyze it. It means that we're in a state where we're kind of, we've kind of hit a plateau. We kind of have stabilized these factors. Another thing that's mentioned on this slide, smartphones stalled upward resolution trends until recently. So going back 10 plus years ago, more and more people started to visit our websites using a smartphone that had 640 pixels across, maximum of 800. Initially they were like 480 pixels. When they were really small, we didn't take them seriously. We're like, yeah, come on, don't bother me with that. Once they got up to 640, 800 range, particularly if you're talking about a larger organization, any organization that has a substantial number of people who are likely to be using smartphones, any website that has an international profile, you can't afford to blow that off, because Android and iPhones were getting more and more popular every year. Everybody could see what was going to happen. Now the smartphone displays are up in the same average range, getting there. In the US, I should say, getting there. The trend is that they're going to equalize with our portable and desktop displays, almost. They'll probably never get to quite the same level, but they're going there very quickly. And the main limitation there has been the engineering to have the power in the graphics processor and the main processor of a tiny little device like that to process in real time, refreshing that screen like 60 times a second. You're talking about a lot of processing power. It's amazing that it's now feasible on smartphones. Okay, and then you can read the rest of this slide. I pretty much already mentioned these points. Okay, and then here are some stats from StatCounter, which is a website which compiles average statistics by country and globally for different important parameters on the web. And no one has completely accurate statistics. There's a lot of different ways to measure these things. You always get different statistics if you measure for a specific country as opposed to internationally. Different demographic segments for different markets, different types, different visitors, different age ranges, and all that. But what we got here, what we have on this slide, is from 2017, the most accurate or the most current year of statistics, from StatCounter for computers in general, which would be desktop monitors and portables and smartphones. And what you can see is that for the regular computers, all of those listed are in that sweet spot range that I mentioned between 720p and 1080p, okay? Because that would be a width of 1280 to 1920. And all of them we see here are in that range. So it's, that's that. For the smartphones, when we go down there, what we see is we see surprisingly low resolutions for what we're used to seeing and buying from the smartphone market in the recent last several years in the US, because the largest percentage there by far is a 640 width display, and the others all less than that. You see a 1280 display for smartphones only showing 5%, but this is international, this is global. So this includes all of Africa, all of Latin America, all of Southeast Asia, and so forth, and almost all those nations, almost all the nations of the world. The price for electronics is substantially more than in the US. It can easily be double the cost of the same model that we can buy something on Amazon. You know, the incomes are usually not as good compared to the cost of goods. There's other factors involved, but the point is that if you look at global stats, like I say, it's not going to be the same for, you know, U.S. stats or the stats for Sweden or the UK or whatever, and so you need to be aware of your demographic for that particular website and market. But what we're going to see here is we're going to see those average smartphone resolutions come right up to be and more or less match the computer stats, is my prediction, with the exception of the desktop displays. Some people get the 4K sort of thing just because they want it, and but that's not going to be the average person. The graphic that's up here in the upper right-hand side of the screen that you see there, believe it or not, I drew that by hand. Can you imagine? Just yesterday, I think. And this is when I was doing this brainstorming of some of these factors like eye, distance to the screen, physical size of the device. And what I found was I recently bought a smartphone, and it has a 1080p display, 1920 pixels across, and the display is only 5.2 inches diagonal. And it just blew my mind. I mean, I knew that when I bought it, but it's still, as somebody who's been in the IT field for 30 years, I still cannot believe what we get now in terms of memory in these tiny devices, especially the smartphones, and processing power and resolution compared to what we had back in the day on the original personal computers and all that, and even just going back 5-10 years. It's incredible. So I got this smartphone, and it's 1920 pixels across on a 5.2 inch display. I thought, that's crazy. The screen I'm using right now to record this video is only 1280 pixels across. 1280, and then it's a little higher than 720 tall. And the reason I use this particular computer for recording my videos is that it's perfect for recording 720p videos, which is still the most common format on YouTube, because I can do an exact screen record, I don't have to resize, and I upload to YouTube. Okay, but the point is, this computer with 1280 across has less resolution than my little smartphone with 1920. But when I thought of it, I thought, well, my smartphone appears to be a little bit clearer and more defined than my 1280p laptop, but not much, you know. I wonder why that is. And then I thought, you know what? It's just because I'm sitting at a greater distance. So I got out my tape measure and I measured the distance from my eye to my screen, and it was 2 feet. And then I used my smartphone and I did the same thing. I took a measurement and it was 8 inches. So 3 times the distance. And that's what this graphic is here. You see, this is where my eye would be. This is the smartphone screen at 8 inches. Here is my regular portable computer display at 24 inches, 3 times the distance. But the diagonal on my smartphone is 5.2 inches. The diagonal on my portable computer is 14. Another one I have is 15. So it's 3 times difference once again. So the punchline is, at 3 times the distance, you know, the resolutions look the same because of the difference in the display size, physical size of the device, which means that a let's say a 720 display or a 1080p display on the 2 different devices, portable computer or smartphone, should look the same, because 3 times the screen size, but 3 times the screen distance. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so here we're back to our opening slide, which means we're done with this presentation. So what I was trying to do here is just cover some of the most important points about what we can call image optimization for web pages, and the file formats, and some of the main issues involved with web graphics. We took a look at a website where the image loading turned out to be literally 500 times larger than was needed for that page. And there were about 12 of those thumbnail images on that page. So 12 times 500 times slower for that load for the graphics on that page. And that's a worst case example, but it shows how that particular issue is important. And then we also covered many more subtle points of, web graphics in this presentation. Okay, so I hope you found it interesting and maybe of some use to you as you get going with your web design or web development career.